Imagine waking up one morning and your neighbour is sick with a strange new disease. Suddenly, they die the next day. Soon, another neighbour is sick, as is your best friend. Within days, the whole town is sick and dying. You are soon forced to flee in fear for your life. I'm not talking about a zombie apocalypse movie. Today, we're talking about the plague. Kia ora. Hello. Last video in the series talking about the plague, we discussed the spread and alternative theories of transmission of the plague through Europe. If you've not watched this, the link will be down below in the description. Today we'll talk about the survivors' accounts and the devastation the plague wrought on Europe. If you haven't listened to the account of the plague I read out by Mortality di Stefani, I'm also going to put that link down in the description below, as I will be referencing this quite a bit. As previously discussed, the plague arrived in Western Europe in 1347, lasting about 5 years before reappearing in 1360 to 1363, and again in 1374 and 1400. It was this first wave which was responsible for the most effect on the population, and is responsible for that mortality rate of up to 60%. Never before had people seen the likes of this disease. Additionally, such was the speed of these symptoms presented to mortality that people were at a loss to respond to this new and sudden disaster which ravaged the world. Although doctors and medical practitioners had not yet the benefits of the Enlightenment, medieval doctors and religious hospices were often capable of offering a relatively reasonable level of medical care. However, having never encountered disease of such magnitude or of this kind, all resources were overwhelmed, leaving doctors to abandon their patients out of fear. I refer to Mortality di Stefano. In the year of our Lord 1348, there occurred in the city and Cortado of Florence a great pestilence, and such was its fury and violence that in whatever household it took hold, whosoever took care of the sick, all carers died of the same illness, and nobody survived beyond the fourth day, neither doctors nor medicine providing of any avail. And there appeared to be no remedy, either because those illnesses were not yet recognized, or because doctors had never previously had any cause to study them properly. He goes on to write, no doctors could be found, because they were dying like everybody else. Those who could not be found wanted exorbitant fees cash in hand. Before entering the house, and having entered, they took the patient's pulse with their heads turned away, and assayed the urine samples from afar with aromatic herbs held to their noses. Left with no other option, the living often fled or shunned the sick, fearing the spread of the plague. We refer to the Scotch chronicler written by John of Fodun, who was in Aberdeen at the time of the plague. People fell sick of a kind of horrible swelling of the flesh, and it lasted barely 2 days. This sickness killed everyone, but especially the middling and lower classes. Rarely the great people. It was so horrific that children did not dare to visit their dying parents, or parents their children, but everyone ran away for fear of catching the illness, as if from a snake. We see a similar account by Mortality di Stefano. Many people who at their passing had neither confession nor last sacraments, and many died unseen, and many died of hunger. For when somebody took ill to his bed, the other occupants in panic told him, "I'm going for the doctor," and quietly locked the door from the outside, but didn't come back. The victim, abandoned by both people and nourishment, yet kept constant company by fever, wasted away. As you can see, it was a natural response for people to flee the plague, leaving plague victims locked in their houses, abandoned to die. In London, it became a way of containing the plague. A plague police was set up, locking the infected in with the sick and waiting, only to open up the house 4 to 5 days later to bury the dead and fumigate all possessions with smoke. More often than not, those in the house who were initially uninfected were dead as well. Not even the cloistered were safe from the plague. As we can see in this account by Irish monk John Klein in the Chronicle of the Annals of Ireland. Since the beginning of the world, It has been unheard of for so many people to die of the pestilence, famine or disaster in a shorter time. Earthquakes threw down towns and castles and swallowed them up. Black Death stripped villages, castles and towns of their inhabitants so thoroughly there was hardly anyone left alive in them. This pestilence was so contagious that those who touched the dead or the sick were immediately infected themselves and died. Because of their fear and horror, men could hardly bring themselves to bury the dead. Many died of boils, abscesses and pustules which broke out on their legs and in armpits. Others died in frenzy, brought on by headache or vomiting blood. It was very rare for one person to die in a house. Usually husband, wife, children and servants went the same way, the way of death. And I, Brother John Klein, a monk from Kilkenny, have written in this book the notable events which happened at the time, for I saw for myself, or having learned them from men who deserve to be believed, so that these notable events should not be lost from the memory of future generations. I, seeing these bad things, and die whole world surrounded by evil, wrote down what I heard and investigated, and I leave parchment for my work to be continued, in case any man can escape this pestilence and continue the work I began. Similarly, Petrarch's brother, who was living in a monastery in Montreal at this time, is said to have been the sole survivor out of 35, and remained there afterwards with his little dog. The account of John Klein is often cited, as he left a blank page in his work to be carried on, yet he is unsure if anyone will survive this catastrophe to do so. This idea both terrifies and excites us today, and is a common trope seen in apocalypse movies, that being a diary left to be read, but the author is unsure as they may be the last person alive. If we look at the scale of those that died, a pre-industrial society cannot deal with the logistics of this issue, let alone the moral and psychological effects it will have. Marcione di Coppo Stefano wrote, "The churches only have one bier apiece, as was the custom, and this was insufficient. Pharmacists and gravediggers had obtained biers, hangings, and laying out pillows at great price. The shroud cloth apparel which was used to cost, for a woman, in terms of petticoat, outer garment, cloth, cloak, and veils, 3 florins, rose to price to 30 florins, and would have risen to 100 florins, except for they stopped using shroud cloth, and whoever was rich was dressed in plain cloth, and those who weren't rich were sewn up in a sheet. The benches placed for the dead cost a ludicrous amount, and there wouldn't have been enough of them if there had been 100 times more." Here we can see the normal accoutrements to accompany burial were unable to accommodate the scale of the catastrophe. Scarcity inflating the very basics, people and ritual demanded to put one out for funeral. William Dean writes in Historia Rufensis, "Alas, this mortality killed so many that no one could be found to carry the bodies of the dead to burial. But men and women carried the bodies of their own little ones to church on their shoulders, and threw them into mass graves, from which came such a stink that it was barely possible for anyone to go past a graveyard." Again, from Marcione di Coppo di Stefano, "At every church, or at most of them, pits were dug down to the water table, as wide and deep as the parish was populous, and therein whoever was not very rich, having died during the night, should be shouldered by those whose duty it was, and either be thrown into this pit, or they would pay big money for someone else to do it for them. The next morning there would be very many in the pit. Earth would be taken and thrown down on them, and then others would come on top of them, and then earth on top again, in layers, with very little earth, like garnishing lasagna with cheese." As we can see, people were forced to dispose of their family and friends in this manner, which was uncommon, although medieval people were not unused to death as we are today. Towns were having to prepare mass graves, and such a sight was very rare and unsettling. Additionally, there were spiritual implications of the plague, not just the sense this was a divine punishment. People were unable to have a proper burial or confession, and this was enormous for the medieval Christian. Death without absolution in and of itself was an even greater terror for the medieval person than death. Pope Clement VI declared that anyone could take final confession, even a woman. He even consecrated the Rhone so people could be thrown into it, as this would be considered holy ground as the cemeteries were filling up. In their paper, Emotional Response to Late Medieval Plague, John D. Young and Professor Larry Bollock assert the initial responses to the plague was to appeal to God to deliver them from disaster. This was first done communally, usually as a religious procession. However, once this failed, responses became individualized, and in their words, a one-on-one fight for survival from an unknown monster. Accounts of the plague are chilling, and the effect of it, I believe, are responsible for the great intergenerational trauma from which we can see in the art of the culture of the time. The plague was responsible for a death toll in the millions and has had an indelible effect on the peoples it left behind. The next video in the series, we will talk about the social impacts the plague had on Europe. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.